So these are just some examples from the history of education and the history of philosophy of critiques of didactic pedagogy. So what I'd like to do now is actually take apart authentic pedagogy, take apart the alternative, because these people are either building alternatives, Maria Montessori very concretely building an alternative system, or they're imagining alternatives a la Rousseau. So what are the dimensions then of authentic pedagogy? I'm going to take the same 8 dimensions with which we analyse didactic pedagogy, which is architectonic, discursive, intersubjective, sociocultural, proprietary, epistemological, pedagogical, moral. So here we are now in a classroom space, actually from the late 20th century, to be quite frank. This is the world, this was before there were computers in the classroom. And this shows a quite dramatic reconfiguration of the classroom. So the students are all sitting around tables, they're able to talk to each other, the students' work is on the wall, the teacher who's over there on the right doesn't really have a privileged position in relation to the class. They can walk around the class. So it's a much more fluid space. So the space has been reconfigured in these really quite radical kinds of ways. It's still a classroom in those old senses, and probably the old desks have been unscrewed from the floor and thrown away. And that's part of the reform that comes with progressive education, authentic education in the last part of the 20th century in this particular classroom. Now, discursive forms. We might have the teacher speaking to the class and see for that purpose the students have actually swiveled around because some of them would otherwise have their back to the teacher in this moment. So the primary orientation, discursive orientation, is student to student. So here's the teacher wanting to say something to the class for a moment, but then over here in this other picture, in this next picture, we have a group of students working together, talking with each other. So it's really, really a big shift where the focus is more on group work, group interaction, discussing what's happening. And these are by nature noisier classrooms. I mean, the premise in the traditional didactic classroom was silence until you're spoken to, put up your hand and we will allow you to speak. But here, the ability to speak, of one's own choice and accord has actually been structured into this environment. And these small groups are structured about, 6 or 8 students being able to talk to each other and listen to each other at any one time. It's a big shift. Intersubjective. In fact, I'm going to focus on just one idea here. We saw a bit of intersubjectivity in the previous image, but in this particular image, what we have here is learner-centered activities and inquiry learning. So this learner, you can see they've got a book, they've got their pencils, they've got some resources, they've got some images. So they're very actively involved in their learning process. So in other words, we're expecting them to be agents of knowledge making, less than they are recipients of reading the textbook, listening to the teacher. So here we've got an actively working learner involved in these student-centered activities. Now, what's happening socioculturally in this time? Well, if you recall, the didactic classroom was really a one-size-fits-all classroom. Everyone's got to listen to the same message from the teacher at the same time, and they've got to be on the same page of the textbook at the same time. Well, what we have in this period of authentic or progressive education is an increasing recognition that there are differences in the classroom, but primarily in the first instance, we deal with those differences through processes of assimilation and integration. So there are quite, powerfully written parts of Dewey where Dewey says the American public school system, what it does is it takes children from all over the world, migrants from all these different places in the world, and what it does is assimilates them. And this is this great melting pot where they all come in different and they interact with each other and they have the same experience of curriculum, the same experience of learning. They speak to each other and they develop a common language. So the school becomes the site of assimilation. So there's some recognition of differences, but really the primary function of the school is to assimilate. A later word that's used is integration, which has a slightly less homogenizing kind of tone to it. It sort of implies that people are going to integrate and relate. Maybe some of the differences will stay. But what happens by perhaps the 70s or the 80s, the third quarter of the 20th century, is we have the rise of ideas of multiculturalism. And initially, I think they're pretty tokenistic. So we're going to study a few other cultures, and we're going to perhaps have a national day and talk about national food. And mostly, it's relatively trivial. But also, what we have in this time is a kind of a streaming. What's relevant to you? What's relevant to you? What's relevant to you? So in other words. To go back to the Dewey example, that one form of streaming is the girls do the needlework and the boys do the metalwork and the woodwork, because the girls are going to become seamstresses and wives, the boys are going to become plumbers and carpenters. So what we can do is, in order to do what's relevant for you, we create differences in the curriculum and differences in the classroom. So this is actually a shift that also happens with authentic pedagogy, a less standardised curriculum and more differentiation around the variety of needs and interests and life destinies of students.